Hi, everybody. Welcome to today's version of Nonprofit Cloud Accelerating Impact with Salesforce. Today, we are going to get into customize or not to customize. That is the question. And so, you know, Kathy, you know me, our standard housekeeping. Kathy will have office hours posted at the end of the deck. You can recap all the information, everything that we've done at the site that is here listed in the deck, and including the video from last week is up there. So today we're going to talk about what is TDTM and how is it useful, about disabling triggers using TDTM, how to create custom code using TDTM, and the order of execution. So NPSP has a lot of objects that connect with each other. So there are many automations coded into the NPSP package. TDTM is an acronym for Table-Driven Trigger Management. TDM provides an admin-friendly declarative interface to reorder coded triggers or whether the triggers fire at all. TDTM. Ugh. So I hate acronyms. If you know what the acronym actually replaces, it's so much simpler to remember what the tool does. So say this with me. Table-driven trigger management. Table-driven trigger management. Table-driven trigger management. I even provided a visual, right? So a table-driven trigger management. And I can assure you that you'll get confused again. And I forget which comes first. Is it TMTD, whatever it is, but it's table-driven trigger management. So once we get that part down pat, then we're halfway there, right? So your first question may be, what is a trigger? So hopefully you know what a trigger is, but you may not have a lot of experience with them. So triggers are simple snippets of code that run in response to something that happens and are part of the programmatic side, in this case of Nonprofit Success Pack. It's Apex code based. And if you're not a developer, then, and I'm not a developer, that makes it a little bit more difficult to understand. But programming with Apex code can do almost anything within Salesforce as long as the functionality stays within the governor limits. Doesn't this all sound familiar? Not much changes from a regular Salesforce org to a nonprofit Salesforce org. It can also be more performant than declarative tools. However, changes usually require a developer, a sandbox instance, and some unit tests. So the TDTM is really a set of records within an object, a trigger handler, managing automations related to triggers. So in accordance with best practices, TDTM provides one trigger per object with multiple trigger handlers. TDTM allows you to control the order of when the triggers fire, and the logic itself is all stored in Apex classes instead of the triggers themselves. And you can work with all this declaratively without writing Apex code. Apex triggers are incredibly powerful. If you've ever seen one in the wild, have you ever seen one in the wild? You may, if you've taken the leap, open the developer console, you may see one in your Salesforce instance. Or if you've taken a Rad Women class, there's a lot of work in triggers and trigger handlers. Kathy and I have both done the Rad Women class, and Kathy has adapted better to the Apex triggers than I have, that's for certain. I can read them a little bit. Writing them is a different story, but as long as you can read them, that's the important thing at this point. Excuse me. So we don't have to write Apex code. Don't worry about that. But it is nice to be able to use this system that was created to be able to turn those triggers on and off. So it's helpful to read and understand what it says. And there are a couple of trailheads in the homework if you want to learn some more, right?
Hey, Melissa.
Yes.
Can I raise my hand? Can you
Sure.
you or Kathy quickly explain what a trigger is and what it does? Because I'm trigger clueless.
Sure. Well, and they really are, triggers are Apex code that are triggered basically by something that happens in the system, right? So you're familiar probably, if you've done any work in flows, it's a sort of a similar situation.
So
But
what's the difference?
so the difference is that triggers are Apex code.
Okay.
Flow is a no-code version of that. And you'll see as we go on through here, some of the differences in some of the instances.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So let's look at table-driven trigger management. So if you go to the waffle menu and open NPSP settings, system tools, and trigger configuration, you'll notice that each class ends in TDTM. You also see the order in which the trigger fires, when the trigger fires, and whether the trigger is currently active or not. Also notice the new trigger handler button that lets you create a new trigger in TDTM. None of the standard nonprofit success pack triggers run asynchronously. So that's important to recognize. If you use asynchronous after events, do it with a lot of caution. Do a lot of testing in your sandbox before you ever take it live. If you're like me, Apex code can be a bit intimidating. So why would we want to even delve into the table-driven trigger management? I was happy for many, many years to know nothing about it. But it actually has some benefits. And some of the benefits are listed here. And we'll touch on some of the other benefits that may hit closer to home for us as nonprofit admins in the next couple of slides. But as we talked about triggers and Apex code and what that can do from the standpoint of scalability, right? So it can handle larger numbers of data, of information, of what is coming into the system much better than something like before what we had, process builders and workflow rules. Also the order of operations. And we're going to talk about that quite a bit because there are limits even here on what the order of operations can be. The flexibility of the TDTM to me is my favorite part because I can turn off certain functionality and leave other functionality on just simply by clicking and making it active or inactive, which you don't have that option in most other cases. The extensibility allows you to create these new trigger handlers. And then performance, because it's utilizing the data manipulation language, it can do things much more quickly. So we're going to talk about disabling triggers using what? Table-driven trigger management. See, we've said it enough, we may have it now. And to disable the triggers for Nonprofit Success Pack, you go back to the waffle menu and open the Trigger Handlers tab. It's its own object. And a quick recommendation to make it easier to use, you can go to the All List view and clone that and add the fields active, class, object, load order, and trigger action, whatever you need to make it easier to find what you're looking for. When you click on that trigger handler name, it opens the record for editing. So we want to talk about the 3 ways that you can disable triggers before we actually look at that record, right? So you can disable the trigger handler entirely. You can disable the trigger handler for 1 or more users, which is really helpful. Or you can disable trigger handlers programmatically, which is much more difficult. But let's explore a use case for disabling a trigger. So imagine you're importing a ginormous amount of data into Nonprofit Success Pack, Gene. And the more automations that are running when you import those large volumes of data, the more likely it is that you'll get error message, right, that occur when the Apex CPU times out or you get a row lock. So making the triggers inactive while you upload that information reduces the opportunity for those types of errors. Conversely, remember that the NPSP triggers are designed to work with each other to accomplish the desired automations. So before disabling a trigger handler, it's important to understand how it will affect your data import. A list of descriptions for each trigger handler class will be available in the resources section that we have today. So there are 3 different ways that we can do this. Here you see we could basically uncheck the active box in the trigger handler record, right? Edit it, uncheck the box. It's not going to run until the active checkbox is rechecked. So this affects everybody in your entire organization, all your users. You'll have people hollering at you and screaming at you if you do this in the middle of the workday and disconnect something for the entire team that they need. But once the data is imported, you be sure to reactivate the trigger handler so that it will work appropriately. Right? But that's one thing that you can do. Another use case for disabling the trigger handler completely is if it conflicts with something else that you're using or that's been built in your system. So you can configure it to work the way that you want it to. You can also disable the trigger handler for 1 or more users. Again, in the record, editing the record, you leave it active, but in this case, you would turn the functionality off for just that 1 user or 2 users, and everyone else in the system would continue to operate, as normal. So to avoid undesired behavior across the system, you can disable the trigger handler for the 1 user who's importing the data, right? So open the trigger handler record, enter the username and the usernames to exclude field, and it won't fire for actions taken by those usernames listed in the username exclude field. Then be sure to turn it back on again, of course, when you get through with your import. Disabling triggers programmatically, you can immediately see why I don't do this. I haven't gotten proficient yet with ChatGPT writing code for me. So if you've got someone who writes Apex code, you can temporarily disable the trigger handlers just for the context of that particular code. You can really get granular with it based on what you're trying to do. And sometimes you need to completely disable it. You can use that as well. The use cases there are a lot of different use cases. As with everything, every organization is its own special snowflake. And sometimes that's what makes it so difficult to identify what the challenges are, if you have one. But with TDTM, at least you can see what triggers are disabled, especially using it in the trigger handler records. You won't be able to see the programmatic disabling of those triggers unless you go and look for it. But simple and easy with the trigger-driven table management, no code required. That's the best of all things. All right, one more time. Custom code using table-driven trigger management. And let's preface this section by saying that creating custom code is an advanced skill. That's probably not something you and I are going to do. And in every best practice and every certification exam you ever sit for, that's the last resort. If there's not a way in Salesforce to already do that, if there's not a way, not an App Exchange app that'll do it for you, if there's not a way to do it declaratively, then you write code. So as a nonprofit cloud administrator or consultant, it's not necessary that you're able to write Apex code. But it is important to understand how the functionality of Nonprofit Success Pack can be extended using custom code created via the table-driven trigger management. I knew I would not get through this whole thing without saying it wrong one time. So the steps to creating and deploying custom code are few, doesn't take a lot. And if you have a developer who can write the actual code, you as an administrator can install and deploy the customer code using the table-driven trigger management tool. So creating the Apex class, writing the test class, those are the things that you need your developer to do. Then you add the trigger handler record with that information and deploy it to production, right? So there's no in-depth technical review available. There is an in-depth technical review available for developers and advanced administrators that is also in the resource section that will provide. So if you want to know more about it and how to create some custom code, I encourage you to give it a go. I have one piece of code that is actually in our Hands-on Connect product that I wrote. And I think it was probably when I was doing Rad Women Code, but it was one of those things of this can't happen, we can't do this, we can't do it. And I'm like, I think we can. And I wrote the code and it was true, we did, and we put it in there. So don't sell yourself short to think that you can't figure it out too. So the important question sometimes is, when do you create custom code using the TDTM tool, right? So that is as varied as the customers that you have, right? But anytime a nonprofit needs more granular control over custom code, and when it's triggered, is a good time to consider. So a couple of examples. An international nonprofit needs regions assigned to records after the opportunity records are created in gift entry. Custom code is written via the TDTM framework so that everything happens in the correct order. That's one thing you don't have a lot of control over sometimes, is what order things actually happen in. Another example for one nonprofit, and this is done around integration, specifically where webhooks from an external system come into a custom object in Salesforce, and a trigger is configured to process the external data, convert it, and push it to a queuable job. And again, that's a good use of the custom code that can be created with table-driven trigger management. And I should have had Jim Gilbert come and lead this class, because he spent 30 minutes with me going over table-driven trigger management, and I understood it immediately from him. Order of execution is the last thing we're going to talk about today. And I know you've probably studied this as you studied for your Salesforce admin exam. It is never a bad thing to go back and review the order of execution. It's the single most important concept for Salesforce as a whole, I think. So from what we've learned about TDTM and how it helps configure the order of execution for triggers, you have a little bit better understanding of how important the order of execution is. Triggers are only one part of the larger puzzle, and you may want to familiarize yourself with the order things happen and when they happen. So this list is horrifically long, and I don't normally do this to be able to put 20 list points on a slide, but I want you to have this and have it available. Sorry, somebody rang my doorbell. My dog is going crazy all of a sudden. So, but this is at a high level what the order of execution looks like when you save a record, if you can imagine. I mean, I haven't looked at this in a while, and I'm like, oh my goodness. There are myriad caveats around the order of execution that are not included here. And interestingly, the only 2 lines of this list that TDTM can truly affect are number 4 and number 8. And that's why they're highlighted, right? So your before triggers and your after triggers. It's also important to understand the order of execution of the other 18 executables in Salesforce to put the trigger order in the proper perspective, as well as the appropriate sequence. And you've probably learned more about order of execution creating flows than anything else, because the before save flow. Let's see, I'm going to tell you wrong now. I better not tell you wrong. But flows work in the same way. And one of the reasons that flows are so helpful is because they help you order the order of execution. Also, some good resources that we'll provide on order of execution. Refresh your memory on those, because a big part of what we need to know. So we've looked at what TDTM is and how it works with Nonprofit Cloud. and the larger Salesforce instance to give you more granular control over how triggers fire in Nonprofit Success Pack. TDTM allows triggers to be turned off, either permanently or temporarily, for some or all users. TDTM allows triggers to be reordered. TDTM also allows new triggers or custom code to be created and placed in the appropriate order within the order of execution. The order of execution is a critical piece of every Salesforce puzzle. With the added functionality that Nonprofit Cloud brings, the order of execution becomes even more important. So be sure you understand where in the order of execution before triggers and after triggers happen, and that'll help you guide the use of TDTM. We've learned about planning a Nonprofit Cloud implementation, installing and configuring Nonprofit Cloud, and delved into some use cases. What's left for us to do? Next week, we're going to focus on the testing and deployment strategies to ensure that everything we have done up to this point works as expected. And Kathy, you want to bring us up to date on office hours and all kinds of great resources here.
Yep. This week I mean, because most of the badges have been actually already covered or at least assigned in previous weeks, there aren't any actual new badges this week. So just, use this week as a time to catch up or work on building a demo in your NPSP org. There are a lot of resources here describing TDTM and several with the order of execution, including a visual one that the architects have put out that actually is a really, I don't know, a lot of us would like to have it as a poster, though they keep changing it so often. So by the time we probably get it ready, it may be obsolete. But anyways, just, it's halfway through that one article that I put there. Reading chapter 14 next week. And this week, the office hours will be at 12 noon on Thursday.
Awesome. And we'll have this video and the slide deck up on the site this afternoon. So let me click the quit record.
Oh,